Hi, everybody. Dobrodošli u JavaScript for Artists. Imam porodicu u Beograd, ali govorim malo ništo hrvato-srpski, tako ja ću da govorim u angleski. Izvinite. It's for the better, trust me. Hi, and welcome. A quick show of hands, I'm curious, who's a developer in this room? Okay. And who would identify as a JavaScript developer, for better or worse, whatever that means, however you feel about it? Okay. And last question, I won't make you do this too much, I promise. Who identifies as some kind of artist or has some sort of creative outlet in their life that maybe brought them here and made them interested in this talk? Okay. I lied, one more question. And who's here because they have no idea what I'm going to talk about and they just thought it sounded kind of interesting at the end of the day? That's usually the case. That's fair. Well, my name is George. When I go to conferences and I listen to people talk, one of the things that helps me remember the content later on is if the speaker sometimes personalizes themselves, kind of introduces themselves. It gives me something to anchor that talk to later. I might remember something about that person. It humanizes it a little bit. So in that vein, I wanted to introduce myself so you get to know me a little bit more. My name is George. I've been an independent freelance developer for about 13 years. I think in JavaScript years, that might be 75, which means I get to retire soon. It's great. I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies. It's a somewhat recent thing. It's kind of fun. The last couple of years, I've really gravitated towards more mentorship-type roles, and that's something I'm interested in. My most known open-source project over the last 13 years is a project called Konami.js. Has anyone heard of that project? Usually, it's 1 or 2 or 0. So the project is an Easter egg JavaScript library that enables the Konami code on your web page. I know that sounds like some web development 101 kind of stuff, and it really is. But in 2009, the feature that separated that from the pack was it worked on smartphones with gestures, which was a little less common back then. And it was strangely popular. Like Marvel used it, Tesla, the car company, used it, Huffington Post used it, Newsweek used it. It makes me laugh that it's my most well-known project, and it's kind of on brand for me. It's frivolous and silly and fun. And that's kind of what this talk is going to be, to some extent. Speaking of Marvel.com, I guess my other claim to fame is I broke Marvel.com for about 30 seconds after an errant git push. They were linking directly to the raw file on GitHub back in 2009 or 10 or something like that. Someone pointed it out to me. I got very excited. I made a little update, and it turns out it crashed the whole site and looked all askew. So I think we all learned some lessons that day. And then my last sort of fun fact that maybe you'll remember that might help you remember content from this talk. I once ran a marathon in North Korea, and I accidentally cheated. I don't advocate cheating in general, but if you do accidentally cheat, you should be mindful of where you happen to do it. There's my proof, just because people think that's interesting. A lot of flags there. And there's my certificate that is fraudulent. Okay, but getting more relevant here, I really like to make things. I'm a developer, I've done that for 13 years, but code wasn't just my profession, it was actually my hobby and my passion for the first half of my life before I even considered it professionally. So I like to make things, I like to take these tools that are part of my trade, and I like to sort of push them to their limit and use them in unexpected ways. And today we're going to kind of look at that. We're going to look at making things in JavaScript, specifically art. So let's talk about the topic. So what do we mean by art exactly? What is art? That could be probably an extremely long talk. Why JavaScript? Zašto JavaScript is what people ask me. These are all good questions. So some of you, when you saw JavaScript for Artists in the title for this talk, you may have thought of, okay, there it is. Maybe something like this, kind of Western, a painting, something you might see in a museum anywhere in Europe. Maybe you thought of something a little more abstract, kind of like this. Some of you, your brains might have gone to something totally non-visual. Maybe you thought of music, or maybe you thought of something kinetic and sort of performative like that. Or maybe you thought of something more experiential. This is a tech conference. I feel like we're getting closer to the ballpark of how people think of these things sometimes. Or something maybe entirely virtual that doesn't even exist in the real world, that exists entirely on your computer. So for today, just to make this easy, I'm going to give you a quick definition of what I mean by art. So my definition for today is anything created for a joyful exploration of a discipline, an expression of something captured only through the work itself, embracing one's curiosity in the pursuit to find an answer to a question, or my favorite of these, more succinctly, something that is not precisely useful but not exactly pointless. That tends to define and accurately describe most of the things I make, and so we're going to look at that and talk about the tools we can use in JavaScript to build these sort of things. And we'll be looking at some of those demos a little more closely here, like right now. So in that vein, here are some things that I've made. Some people, when they start their day in the morning, they like to do a crossword and get a cup of coffee to get their brain going. I like to make JavaScript doodles sometimes. Sometimes they're literally doodles. Sometimes they are just little one-off experiments, usually visual, to get my brain going in the right way but not do anything quite too serious. So let's see. Sometimes I literally make tools that allow me to doodle. If I can see my mouse, well, there we go. Something like this. This is a little drawing application I made using p5.js. It's kind of fun. And sometimes I make other doodle tools that look sort of like this. I don't think you can see my cursor up there, but I'm drawing on the screen in case you can't gather. And all of these things are pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but I find it gets my brain going in the right kind of a way. It sort of allows me to relax while simultaneously sort of engaging the right parts of my brain that I'm going to need to program that day. Let's do one more. How about, oh, here's a good one. Here's a clock that runs backwards and forwards at the same time. Now, just in case you can't quite see the clock, oops. There we go. Now you can kind of see the hands a little bit. So let's get back to, oops. OK, so back to one of those questions I had up. Why JavaScript? So why are we choosing JavaScript for this kind of pursuit? Basically, it's everywhere. It's on the browser. It's on the server. You can find it on hardware. You can find it in places it was never really intended to live. There's a really low barrier to entry to learning JavaScript, for better and worse. You know, it started off almost as not exactly a hobby language, but it was not really designed from the get-go to do all the things we are doing with JavaScript today. I think in the case of creative exploration and making things, that's actually a huge advantage. And it's where the people are. There are so many conferences and meetups and GitHub projects and things like that. Today is a pretty good day to be a JavaScript developer. It's also uniquely suited for making this kind of stuff because of a couple other reasons. The ubiquity that I mentioned before, but also the browser. The browser is kind of an underrated, amazing tool when it comes to creating interesting, creative things. You know, we have a piece of software that lets us create virtual interfaces really easily. It lets us somewhat literally draw on the screen using the canvas and WebGL. It can be our eyes and our ears with the webcam or the microphone. It's a piece of software that lets us have like a two-way conversation with the people who are looking at whatever it is we made. And there's really nothing like it. And JavaScript is the language to use if we're going to be engaging in that kind of a way. And then, like I kind of said previously, industry and community support. If something, you know, particularly, I'm particularly interested these days in some of the machine learning and AI things that are coming out. I think a lot of us are. And I also think, if I'm being honest, a lot of us maybe barely understand it, but can dabble in it a little bit. I know that explains me pretty well. One of the nice things about this new space, and any new space, is if a company releases a new API or a service, there's a very, very good chance they're going to release some kind of JavaScript SDK or some way for you to interface with it using JavaScript pretty easily. So that's another reason I think it's a very good language for this sort of thing. So why is this important? I've talked about why JavaScript is uniquely suited for creating fun, goofy, creative, cool things, but why does it matter, right? You know, and some of you might think it doesn't matter. This is kind of a waste of time or something we do when we have free time, which none of us probably feel like we have, or at least in the US, I never feel like I have free time. I think that through play, we become better developers. Children learn through playing games and exploring in that kind of a way, and as we get older, we find less time to do that, and I don't think that has to be the case. I think it's still a really fabulous tool for learning these sort of things. Making art forces us to think about problems a little differently, which I'll show you in a moment here. A lot of advances in early computing kind of owe themselves to people dabbling in this creative, expressive way. A lot of people don't know that. I'll show you a couple slides here in a moment. And then lastly, particularly in some of these more new and emerging fields like AI and machine learning, I find it's a very good opportunity to play around with those APIs and services. In my day-to-day work for my clients, I do not find a lot of opportunity to use TensorFlow. It doesn't come up in my day-to-day development, but I think it's really interesting. I can find a lot of opportunities to make art using TensorFlow and related projects. And wherever that technology is going, being able to dabble with it through art allows me to be aware and keep my skills up, even though I don't have any work necessarily in that field. And then lastly, I like to tell people this, we can't be experts at everything. We're all amateurs at something, and I think we should celebrate that to some extent. A lot of people have we have imposter syndrome. We worry that we're missing out on what we need to know. Let's just celebrate it and, play with our tools. So touching on what I said a moment ago about thinking about things differently through art, I think this doesn't necessarily have to be an exercise that is purely about creating something visual or interactive or abstract in some sort of like a piece in that sense. I think our approaches to coding can be creative and art in themselves. I have a little side project of my own. I'm calling it 101 Ways to Say Hello World. It came to me one day, and it's been kind of fun to explore. It's in JavaScript, of course. This was the first one that I wrote in this series. It's the one I would probably choose on Stack Overflow if someone asked me, how do you say hello world? Seems correct enough. And then I thought, well, how many different ways can I find to say hello world? How many convoluted approaches can I take to a very simple, the very first problem we solve as developers? And so I thought, well, I could do something like this. I could create an array, and then I could join them and spit it out to the console. That's kind of fun, I guess. And then I thought, well, I could just visually arrange it in kind of a fun way on my page. I was looking at some comments that were in a piece of code I was working with, and I enjoyed the way they were visually laid out. And I thought, oh, that's something I could do. That's kind of silly. And then I went back to the array, and I thought, well, I could reverse it, and then I could use a different kind of for loop, a more recursive kind of approach. And then I thought, why am I, extracting the actual letters? I could use the Unicode and start, spitting out the letters based on that. And then what was this one? I can't exactly remember. I think I'm shifting the character codes up 1 or down 1. It's like the world's shittiest cryptography, basically. And then I said, oh, I haven't used any regular expressions yet. Now I have 2 problems, right? And then this one, I thought, I'm getting these error messages in the console sometimes when I make typos. What if I actually captured the error messages themselves, extracted the letters I need to spell hello world, and just run through all the errors until I can actually spell hello world in the console? And it goes on. Here's my super recursive approach. Here's my alphabet function. You have to call the alphabet function the number of times based on where the letter is in the alphabet to return the letter. Anyway, you get the sense. You could look at this and say it's a waste of time, which would not be inaccurate on some level. This doesn't produce anything that needed to be produced. But the process and the creative exploration, I think, was really fun and actually, in a roundabout way, beneficial for me as a developer, just to think about it this way. So let me touch on real quickly what earlier I mentioned. A lot of early advances in computing sort of owe themselves to this kind of messing around. And a lot of these things happened a lot earlier than people tend to realize. The first computer music goes back to 1951. Synthesized speech goes back to 1961. The first imagery was also in the 50s, animations in the 60s, an interactive 3D piece of art was made in 1971. I'm going to show you quick clips of all these. And pretty much all of these were not someone trying to solve a specific problem necessarily, but someone just playing around in their downtime and stumbling across something that turned out to be pretty clever. So the first computer music, Christopher Strachey, one of these early computer people, he was working on the Mark II, one of the first computers. And there was something built into that computer that there was a disk that would spin and a tone would sound whenever a certain process was done. Obviously, the processes took a lot longer to run, so you'd have to sit there and wait for things to happen. But he noticed that he could write his code in a particular way to change the rate at which that disk was spinning. And depending on how quickly it was spinning, it would make different pitches. And he noticed they sounded like musical tones. And so he wrote a program that would basically spin that disk at different frequencies, at different intervals, until he had a program that could actually produce music. And he created the first, what's thought to be the first bit of computer music doing that, basically. He stayed up all night playing around with it because he thought it was fun. And here's a recreation of that I'm going to play. Oh, I forgot. I don't have sound. Well. Could everyone hear that sort of okay? I mean, you got the gist of it. I apologize, I forgot to get the sound set up here. Speech synthesis, like I said, happened in 1961.
In the next selection, the computer sings a familiar ditty. Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer to.
I remember when the speech synthesis API came out in Chrome, and I was really excited about it, and I thought that was so cool, and then I found that, and I thought, why did it take so long? It's like 50, 60 years ago, you know, we had something that sounded about the same. And then I was looking up what was the very first example of graphics from a computer, and I found this, which was sort of maybe not surprising in some level, but this was a $200+ million piece of military equipment. It was a radar scanner of sorts. In today's money, that would be 2 billion USD, which is unfathomable in some ways. And basically, when the radar would boot up and get started, it would show this pinup girl on the radar thing, and that was part of the diagnostic process to let you know everything was okay. I mean, it's from so long ago, there's something slightly funny about it, but I think it's more telling that we probably needed more women in tech from the beginning. Anyway, that's the first image that I could find, supposedly. One of the first animations. I'm not going to let this play out because it takes a very long time, but it is kind of cool. A hummingbird eventually draws up on the screen. This is the same company that did the speech synthesis earlier here. And then this was actually intended to just be a piece of art from the get-go. And what's really cool, you can't tell just from this video, obviously it's a 3D animation, it's abstract, it's supposed to be a fish. It looks like a human head with like a fish tail to me or something. I guess the way this works, I've never seen it in person, but you can actually physically manipulate it in some way and change the color and the direction. So it's not just something you sit there and watch on the screen, it's something you can actually interact with in some capacity, which is really cool and really reminded me of what I was talking about earlier about how the browser is a tool we can use to let people interact physically with these things that we make. And then here's some generative poetry and stuff. I'll skip ahead here. So let's talk about the tools that we have as JavaScript developers to make creative and interesting things in the browser. Obviously, we have the browser, to use as a virtual interface and as a canvas. I don't mean literally the Canvas API. I mean a surface to paint pictures on and create images. We also have hardware. Who's dabbled with JavaScript on hardware in here? Anybody? Curious? You're missing out. If you've ever been interested in like hardware programming, there are some very interesting opportunities for JavaScript on hardware. I've actually got one up here that I'm going to use in a little bit. And what's really cool about doing hardware development, particularly in JavaScript, is now we're straddling the line between the virtual and like the real physical world. We can create in the browser a button on the screen that you press and then something happens, or we can create a physical real world button that people go over and hit in real life and then have something happen. Now we're straddling the line between the virtual and the real worlds here. And then lastly, the third sort of general category that I'm lumping these things into is all of the AI and machine learning stuff that's out there right now and interesting, creative ways we can apply that. This is by no means a complete summary, but this is just sort of how I have categorized some of the tools that we can use here. So let's real briefly just kind of look at what we can do in the browser, like the tools available to us in the browser to build some of these things. So we have the DOM for building our virtual interfaces. We have Canvas and WebGL for making more visually interesting things. We have web audio for sounds. We have media capture, like I said, the eyes and the ears of the browser if we want to see the person who is looking at the thing that we've made or listen to them. And then we have things like WebRTC and WebSockets if we want to do real-time communication with other pieces of art that we've made on other computers or other people around the world in real-time collaboration. Okay? So I only have about 10 minutes. I will confess to you right now, I've given this talk before. This is the first time I've tried to cram it into 30 minutes, so I will move a little quickly through this and then just jump straight into some of the demos to show you some cool things here. Okay? So there are a lot of libraries that you can use to make working with Canvas and WebGL a lot easier. I've put p5.js in bold. If you take away nothing else from this talk today, go home and look up p5.js. Who's heard of processing, out of curiosity, the software that's mostly done in Python? It's great for visualizations and art. p5 is like the browser version of that, basically. And there's a lot of libraries and things for working with sounds. That actually, I don't have that with me today, but that does work. Esperino is a really cool way to explore JavaScript on hardware. This thing I'm holding right here is actually a small Esperino. It's a little microcontroller. And what it does is it has a JavaScript interpreter on board, so you can write pure JavaScript, upload it to the thing, and program it like you might an Arduino or some other little small single board controller like that. And if you want to get into the world of AI and machine learning, there are lots of libraries and things like that. TensorFlow has a JavaScript port, which is really interesting, but more easy to use, I find, are the projects that are powered by TensorFlow. ML5.js and Magenta.js is a Google project that is specifically for machine learning to empower creative endeavors like music and art. It's really cool. I highly suggest looking it up. So let's see here. Yeah, Magenta.js. So I have a whole section on facial recognition, which is really cool and another part that plays into this if you want to literally look at the people who are looking at whatever it is you made. But I'm going to just jump straight into a bunch of demos and show them to you and talk briefly about what's in them and then call it a day. So let's see. I showed you some of the sketches I made early on, just sort of little doodle things. Sometimes they're more generative and kind of interesting, things like that. This is all made with p5.js and some interesting math. I'm trying to find a color combination that has more contrast on this projection here. You can sort of see it here. So here's a project I'll show you. This is actually, I made this years ago. I'm a musician, but I'm actually a very analog musician. I play guitar. I was playing at a winery with this jazz duo, and we wanted something behind us that would be visually interesting for people to watch because we were not very interesting to watch. And we came up with this. It was very pretentious, but a lot of fun to make. I used a different controller at the time. So what I've done is I have programmed my Esperino using JavaScript to be recognized as a MIDI musical instrument by my computer. And I'm using the Web MIDI API in the browser to listen for notes being played from this. And then up on the screen, it's triggering different visualizations and poetry, which is being randomly generated from a bunch of public domain books that I found at archive.org. And so every time I would click on this, we would get a new, sometimes meaningful, sometimes not, poem. Let's see if I can get some sound here. There we go. Anyway. Let's see here. And then dabbling with facial recognition, here is something I made that looks for my face here in the browser, and you can see it makes sort of a sparkly outline. It follows my face as I move here. That was using, I think, the face API.js, which is a library based on TensorFlow. And I think I have like 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. OK, cool. Let's see here. I want to show you something really cool using the magenta.js. So you can do something called an arbitrary style transfer, where you take the computed style of one thing and you apply it to the other image. That's my totally out-of-date headshot that makes me laugh every time I see it. So what I've done here is I took this colorful array of circles, which is something I made with p5.js one morning, dabbling around. And I've taken the style of that, whatever that means precisely, and applied it to my face. And this is hours of fun. I highly recommend it. Sometimes the effect is kind of like a cheesy Photoshop filter. Sometimes it's a little more interesting and profound. Yeah, so sometimes I'll take something I generated. I took a painting that my mother made a long time ago, and I'm going to apply that to my face here. It takes a moment. This is very computationally intense, so sometimes it takes a moment. I've made the images as small as I reasonably can for this demo and to make it quick. Of course, if the internet's acting up, this also may not work at all, so I'll just pause a moment here. Oh, there we go. I think it changed just now. It's kind of subtle up on the projector. I'll do one more just to sort of demonstrate. So let's take this one, another visualization I made. Oh, there we go. That one's a little cooler. So this is actually a really fun way to sort of combine art. You can take art you might have made in like the real world, in the physical world, I should say, like drawings and paintings, create interesting generative things using p5.js or something else, and then combine them together in a totally cool and interesting way. Let's do this one. We'll take a famous painting like that and apply that to my face and see what it looks like. Oh, sometimes it's more interesting than others. It's hard to know until you do it. Okay, and then I think the last thing I will show you, I didn't have time to go super in depth into the facial recognition, but this is a demo that is running entirely on the client side. So it's not making any calls to any AI services or whatnot here. It's going to look at my face, and it's going to try to tell how I'm feeling, and it's going to respond on the screen. And the hardest part of this demo is, oops, let me try this again. Hold on. The hardest part of this demo is trying not to laugh because I have to keep a straight face. So it's supposed to play that song that we started to hear when it thinks I'm sad. Because I'm talking right now and it's looking at me, it's all over the place, as you can see. So let me reload it. I'll try to keep a straight face. Needs to load all the models to recognize my face. OK, so I'm pretty much happy. Oh, now I'm sad. Thinks I'm sad. And so if I step back in front of it and if I make an angry face, it should stop playing right away, hopefully. The problem is I have a hard time making an angry face. Darn it. OK. Anyhow, the idea was I wanted a bot that would try to cheer me up when I'm feeling blue, as you can see. I think I am, oops, no, we will do that. So there are a lot of different ways to do facial recognition. I have 1 minute, which is not quite enough time to dive into all that. But if you go to my website, javascriptforartists.com, I have a little more information about that. And I'm more than happy to talk to anybody out in the hallway about these things. These are some other style transfers I did with some different photos and things that I made, just to demonstrate that. And yeah, that's my presentation for today. Thank you very much. Fala puno. And I might have 30 seconds for questions if that works, or maybe not. No.
Anyone has any questions for George?
Have you ever tried to make some visualization on an audio input, like
So, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the whole question.
If you have some kind of input, musical, have you tried to visual it?
I've dabbled.
Make a visualization, yeah.
Yeah, rozumiem. Not very much. It's on my very long list of things to play with, for sure, though. There's a lot of cool stuff being done in that area, though, for sure.
Hello. You said that you use this practice as I don't know how to say, but morning wake up and brain wake up. Do you manage to do a whole project in one morning, or it spreads?
Some of them, sometimes. I mean, something that. Something like that I was able to do in a morning. Something like the facial recognition in the song and all that. No, that took me. That was actually an afternoon on the weekend. I lied about that one.
Okay, it's relief to know that.
Yes, no, I'm terrible. Trust me. No. Some of these things took me an embarrassing amount of time.
Any more questions? Well, thank you once again, George, for this colorful presentation.
Well,
and use the Eventify application to rate, George.